This hearing will come to order if all of the members will take their seats. Today we're going to focus on our interests, on U.S. interests on the continent of Africa. And as members know, this committee has been in the lead of U.S.-Africa policy for many, many years. Last Congress was no different, with several laws passed, and I'll just remind the members, we passed the Electrify Africa Act, which will bolster power and electricity projects across the continent. It'll spur a lot of economic growth. We passed the End Wildlife Trafficking Act, which combats the threat of poaching, illegal poaching, and the trafficking of elephants and rhinos. And we closed down the ivory trade with this legislation. The profits here were linked to extremist groups, which was another important point. The Global Food Security Act improves our ability to respond to food emergencies, and we also successfully reauthorized the African Growth and Opportunity Act to expand opportunities for increased trade and investment. Not too long ago, the committee fought to establish landmark programs like PEPFAR and the Millennium Challenge Corporation. As this work was done in a bipartisan way over the last few years, we operate the same way today, and I would like to thank Ranking Member Engel and Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Bass for their leadership on these issues. Africa has 1 billion customers. That's one way to look at it, 1 billion consumers. It has a huge potential as a trading partner and as a U.S. job creator. Some of the fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa, including 6 of the top 13 countries that grew the fastest over the last 3 years. And this makes our economic engagement on the continent critical. But according to a recent news report, Chinese engagement with the continent may be the largest global trade and investment spree in history, unquote. Simply put, the U.S. cannot get caught watching from the sidelines here. And our efforts to combat Islamist extremism is not confined to the Middle East. ISIS affiliates and Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, and the Al-Qaeda affiliate throughout the Maghreb have to be addressed head on head through counterterrorism initiatives and support for our partners in Africa. One witness today will tell us about his exploits fighting wildlife traffickers, and many of these wildlife traffickers today are linked to terrorists. Efforts to strengthen democratic institutions and government capabilities must go hand in hand with our efforts to address these challenges. And unfortunately, tragically, too many African countries are off the democratic track. Critical situations require immediate leadership and direction from the U.S. government. With 3 famines looming on the continent, deliberate deprivation of humanitarian aid by South Sudan's political leaders, and ongoing political instability in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the U.S. must remain active and remain engaged. And I want to thank again those members that are traveling to the region in the next few weeks addressing these issues. And I'm pleased also by last week's nomination of Ambassador Mark Green to lead USAID. We look forward to working with this former committee member to continue to provide communities with life-saving aid from the American people. Aid also helps open African markets to sell U.S. goods and services. However, I am concerned by the delay in appointing an Assistant Secretary for Africa at the State Department. And the Department needs to demonstrate how the administration's proposed budget cuts don't put the progress we've made in jeopardy. As we will hear today, our engagement with Africa is in the strategic interest of the U.S., not only to address urgent humanitarian needs there in Africa, across the continent, but also to advance our critical economic interests, our political interests, our security interests. Now is not the time to pull back. And so I will now go to our ranking member, Mr. Engel of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening this hearing, and to our witnesses, welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee. We're grateful for your time and for your expertise. The region we're focused on today, Sub-Saharan Africa, holds tremendous importance for the United States and for other emerging global powers. If we don't give Africa the focus it deserves, those strategic opportunities will slip away at great cost to the United States and, I believe, to countries across the continent. In recent years, American policy has played a major role in driving political, economic, and security progress in Sub-Saharan Africa. For the most part, these policies have won strong bipartisan support. They've also shown good results. Working together, we've helped promote economic opportunity through the African Growth and Opportunity Act, what we call AGOA, and the Electrify Africa Act. We've improved access to life-saving health care through the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, and through the American response to the Ebola crisis in West Africa in 2014. And we've worked to tackle the problem of wildlife trafficking, which is tied to so many other criminal activities, through the End Wildlife Trafficking Act. These initiatives are great examples of how doing good for other people also does good for America's interests. If we can help provide access to reliable power or health care, we should. It's the right thing to do. At the same time, when we make these investments, we're helping communities and countries become more stable and more prosperous. It adds up over time, and we end up with stronger partners on the world stage and populations who view the United States as a friend. But these efforts, as worthwhile as they are, haven't made a dent in other challenges facing many African countries. For example, conflict and climate change have given rise to massive humanitarian crises, including an ongoing famine in South Sudan and the risk of famine in Somalia and northeastern Nigeria. The victories we've achieved are fragile, and a lot of work remains to meet remaining challenges. So I'm worried that after robust engagement during both the Bush and Obama administrations, United States policy toward Africa has suddenly gone adrift. Part of this is due to some diplomatic missteps. In April, Secretary Tillerson invited the chair of the African Union Commission to meet in Washington, then at the last minute canceled the meeting. In March, the African Global Economic and Development Summit took place in California. Not a single citizen of an African country was granted a visa by the State Department to attend this event. I have to ask, would the Secretary of State brush off the European foreign policy chief? When we hosted the APEC summit in 2011, how many citizens of Asian countries did we turn away? Mistakes like this send an unfortunate message. What sends an even clearer message, and will do real harm to people across Africa, is the administration's proposed international affairs budget cut. If we cut by nearly a third our investment in diplomacy and development, we put at risk all the work we've done to foster good governance, economic growth, and counterterrorism efforts. And I'm happy and I'm pleased to say that when we held hearings in this committee, but people on both sides of the aisle spoke out against these horrific budget cuts. Cutting USAID initiatives and support for UN organizations will put lives at risk. The appalling reinstatement and expansion of the global gag rule will have an outsized impact on African countries, cutting off vulnerable communities, especially women and girls, from needed health care. Scaling back the Peace Corps will undermine one of our most cost-effective tools of providing assistance in building relationships with other cultures. And expanding the American military engagement on the continent just doesn't make sense if we're not also working on a parallel track to address the drivers of political instability. The good news is that Congress decides how much we invest in foreign affairs and where we put that money to use. We have the power of the purse. So I'm confident as we move forward, we will continue to give our initiatives in Africa the resources they need, and that we will do more to address the range of unmet challenges. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about the best way forward on these issues. I again thank Chairman Royce and Ms. Bass for all her work on this. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. This morning, we are pleased to be joined by a very distinguished panel. General Kip Ward served as the first commander of the U.S. Africa Command Forces. He served there from 2007 to 2011. We have Mr. Brian Christie, an investigative journalist from the National Geographic, specializing in wildlife trafficking, in the ivory trade, and in conservation. We have Mr. Tony Carroll, adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He served on the Africa Advisory Board at the Exim Bank, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and he got his start as a Peace Corps volunteer in sub-Saharan Africa. Ambassador Reuben Brigitty served as the U.S. representative to the African Union. The ambassador also served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of African Affairs. Without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements will be made part of the record here, and members are going to have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or any questions that they might have for the witnesses or any extraneous material into the record. And we will start with General Ward, and we'll ask all of you if you could summarize your remarks. General Ward, please.
Mr. Chairman, ranking member, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on the important nexus between security and development on the African continent and how interconnected they are from a philosophical standpoint, but also operationally between the Department of Defense and USAID in particular, but other U.S. government agencies that promote development and good governance. Proudly wearing the cloth of our nation, I was privileged to be the inaugural commander of the United States Africa Command, and having previously served in the Balkans as the commander of the NATO force in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in the Middle East as the U.S. Security Coordinator, Israel and Palestinian Authority. In each of these 3 critical environs, I was able to witness firsthand that American security is well served when nations take and are supported in taking positive steps to advance their economic sector, to better serve their populations, and inroads are made such that governance issues are advanced in service to their people. I've submitted a written statement, and in it, I describe this notion of creating societal stability by providing a horizon of hope. When this happens, fragile societies are less susceptible to the conditions that foster instability and reduce the prevalence of failing or fragile state scenarios easily exploited by terrorists, criminals, and other negative actors. When the United States provides developmental support to fragile states, our national security interests are served and our national security is enhanced. Development is the long-term guarantor of stability. No amount of bullets or bombs can do that. As was the case for post-conflict Europe and Asia, where the United States made strategic developmental investments, this is no less true for Africa. The African continent is 3.5 times the size of the continent of the United States, with vast resources, markets, and agricultural potential. Population growth in Africa exceeds that occurring anywhere else on the globe. Burgeoning youth populations, huge potential for rising middle class, and its demand for goods and services reinforce the importance of programs that advance health, literacy, and access to a better life, lest these populations create burdens on other regions of the global commons. And as importantly, create safe havens for the export of terrorism and illegal activities requiring huge resources to counter. Preventing this from occurring is a far better and much less costly alternative than having to react to the negative impact of these ills. Our national support to these vital developmental projects and programs, led by the United States Agency for International Development and other developmental entities, are modest investments, proportionally speaking, that serve our national security interests more efficiently than having to react to crises as voids are created and gaps exist. To make a difference over time, we must sustain our engagement, including developmental engagement, diplomatic engagement, and security engagement over time. Thank you, sir, and I'm prepared to respond to your questions and comments to the best of my ability.
Thank you, General Ward. Thank you very much for agreeing to testify here today. We're going to go to Mr. Brian Christie, but I understand that Mr. Christie has a 1-minute video that he would like us to contemplate here, so.
Yes, sir. We're National Geographic, so we come with our toys.
This and this.
I want to go after kingpins of the ivory trade. What I'm doing is injecting a virus into the system. This technology enables us to track what route this ivory takes.
This has never been done before.
It's dangerous on several levels here. My technology has started to tell me a story. Coney, he's been operating as a terrorist for the last 25 years, have been murdering tens of thousands of people. Who does Coney sell the ivory to? All the way to Darfur. It is considered one of the most dangerous roads in the world. This is not just a conservation question anymore. This is a terrorism question. It is ivory for arms.
We're talking organized slaughter. These are criminals. I'm going to go after them, I'm going to find them, and I'm going to expose them.
Chairman Royce,
Mr. Christie, you have our attention.
I can never live up to the techniques of National Geographic film crews. Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, distinguished members of the committee, I would like to thank you for holding this important hearing today to explore ways to strengthen U.S. ties with African countries. The leadership of this committee on enhancing this bond is critical, and I am grateful for the opportunity to share my expertise to assist with your mission. My name is Brian Christie. I'm a journalist with National Geographic Society Explorer. My specialty is international wildlife crime. For the past 7 years, I have focused almost exclusively on investigating the killing of elephants and rhinos for their ivory and horns. I do not come to this field as a biologist specializing in animals. I come to it as a lawyer turned investigator specializing in transnational crimes with strategic significance. Illegal wildlife trade amounts to billions of dollars per year, inspiring corruption, murder, the destabilization of governments, the spread of disease, the devastation of species, and the destruction of ecosystems. The negative impact of the ivory and rhino horn trade is so great it warrants classifying elephants and rhinos as global strategic resources. This morning, however, I would like to draw the committee's attention to the people on the ground who protect wildlife and protected areas. Park rangers, game wardens, and other local crime fighters who find themselves in a battle that extends well beyond wildlife, a battle against transnational criminal enterprises, including terrorist and extremist groups, which underscores America's interest in Africa and its wildlife. Many of the most violent terrorist and extremist groups operating in Africa today have sought or currently find refuge in parks or protected areas. Boko Haram in Sambisa Forest, Nigeria. Joseph Kony and his Lord's Resistance Army in Garamba National Park in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The FDLR, the Rwandan Hutu rebel militia in Virunga National Park, DRC, the perpetrators of the '94 Rwandan genocide in which 800,000 people died. This list goes on. Many of these groups traffic ivory or rhino horn for arms and other needs, including the LRA, the FDLR, Seleka, and al-Qaeda-linked groups operating in Mali, where 3 al-Qaeda-linked Islamic extremist groups have recently merged. Other groups, such as al-Shabaab in Somalia and FDLR in the Congo, exploit forest resources to finance themselves, taxing charcoal, for example. These groups are responsible for massive destabilization across the continent. Boko Haram has been implicated in the murder of 15,000 people and the displacement of more than 2 million. Kony's LRA has abducted over 7,000 people and killed more than 3,000 others. Park rangers are often their victims. In 2014, Virunga's Chief Ranger Emmanuel Demerode was shot 4 times in the stomach and legs. This extraordinary champion for economic development and conservation in the Congo continues his work running the most dangerous park in the world to be a park ranger, where he's lost more than 40 men under his command. 2 weeks ago, a section of his park was overrun by about 300 suspected ADF, the Ugandan jihadist militia, and Mai Mai militia. Losses have been reported on both sides, and they engaged again on Monday. These groups are using forests as hideouts and to exploit villages for their food, shelter, water, and medicines. They rape, murder, they kidnap children, they compromise the security of forests where doctors and researchers might investigate emerging disease, such as Ebola and Marburg virus. In this environment, park rangers operate as a first line of defense, not just for animals, but also for people. In many cases, park rangers are the only legitimate law enforcement to protect and stabilize these communities. And what happens to communities in this part of the world all too often happens for these countries as well. This is not a call for indiscriminate militarization. When soldiers bring weapons into the bush, they tend to use them, decimating species and exacerbating wildlife and resource trafficking. But by addressing the needs of park rangers and other stewards on the ground in Africa, by facilitating networking among rangers around the world, by training prosecutors and judges regarding wildlife crime, by supporting a free press, by working to reduce demand for threatened wildlife, and by engaging at a diplomatic level with government leaders across the continent regarding wildlife crime and violent extremism, the United States has an opportunity to advance its interest in national security, health, human rights, the environment, and wildlife. I would again like to thank Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and the full committee for allowing me to submit testimony today. Your legislation, the End Wildlife Trafficking Act, signed into law in 2016, is exactly the kind of leadership the world needs. I look forward to working further to advance these goals and am happy to take your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Christie. We go down to Mr. Carroll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This month marks the 17th anniversary of the signing into law of AGOA. That historic legislation would not have been enacted without the efforts of yourself and other members in this room, along with those members no longer in Congress, including Jim McDermott, Phil Crane, Charlie Rangel, Bill Thomas, Don Payne, and Bill Archer. Since AGOA's passage, the economic landscape in Africa has changed dramatically. First, as you noted in your introductory remarks, between 2008 and 2014, Africa's GDP grew on average of 5%, with some countries exceeding 8% annual GDP growth. And the most dynamic growth of Africa's burgeoning services sector. Second, overseas development assistance, including U.S., has fallen behind foreign direct investment and remittances in volume of financial flows into Africa. And last, as you noted earlier, China is now Africa's largest trading partner at $172 billion in annual trade last year, twice that of the United States, and Africa's investment patterns have followed suit. I'll devote my testimony to the examination of the relationship between trade and investment and identify the ways in which the U.S. and Africa can benefit from an expanding relationship. AGOA has produced a modicum of success. Two-way trade between Africa and the United States is approximately $80 billion a year. From 2000 to 2016, non-petroleum imports from AGOA countries have shown strong growth, up 75% over the same period, mostly concentrated in automobiles, apparel, and agricultural products. China's trade has been criticized as being unbalanced and defined by export of raw commodities from Africa and the import of finished goods from China to Africa. In contrast, AGOA trade includes sophisticated products such as luxury automobiles and fine wine from South Africa, fashion apparel from Lesotho, Mauritius, and Kenya, and cut flowers from Kenya and Ethiopia, gem diamonds from Botswana and Namibia. Some of those aren't captured in trade data as they're sent through third countries. Indeed, the United States purchases over 1/3 of Africa's diamonds. At the same time, U.S. trade and balance with AGOA countries has improved significantly since 2000. Focusing on non-petroleum trade, U.S. trade balance has improved from $1.3 billion trade deficit in 2000 to an $831 billion trade surplus in 2016. U.S. exports to the AGOA countries have grown by a greater percentage since 2000, up 130%, than have U.S. imports from the same countries, up 75%. This is a winning program for U.S. jobs. Although job creation statistics in Africa are at best estimates, it is widely believed that AGOA has created hundreds of thousands of new direct and indirect jobs in Africa and the United States. In South Africa alone, it is estimated that 60,000 direct jobs have been created by AGOA and another 100,000 indirect. In investment, U.S. remains a major investor in Africa. Blue chip companies not only U.S. companies bring money, but they also bring best operating global practices, technology, and training. In 2016, the U.S. invested just under $4 billion in Africa. Indeed, there is a relationship between investment and trade. For example, GE invested in a locomotive manufacturing plant in South Africa in accordance with local content, and most of those imports are coming from the United States. The China experience has been noted before. Clearly, China's growth, not only in trade but in investment, has grown to $60 billion, $36 billion last year, and with the FOCAC and One Belt, One Road conferences recently being convened, that is going to expand dramatically. Trade capacity development has been a partner to U.S. increased AGOA imports. The U.S. development agencies have spent nearly $500 million on trade capacity development, and these trade has been run through the various trade hubs in Africa. These trade hubs have supported $854 million in African exports to the United States and elsewhere, and $195 million in leveraged investments. Because of the interest among Africans to increase U.S. investment into Africa and not just development assistance, these hubs have broadened their mandate to include new capabilities in fostering links between U.S. investors and African opportunities at the firm, project, and sectoral level. Just this month, USAID led a group of pension investors to Africa and will organize a reverse mission later in the year. Africa is the population center of the world in the next 2 generations. And while that presents a challenge, opportunity in providing labor surplus and opportunities for manufacturing, it is also a challenge because if not harnessed well, it can create the opportunities for terrorism and massive emigration as we've seen. So some of the recommendations that I have in terms of expanding U.S. investment relations with Africa are continued efforts to increase market size. Many American companies eschew opportunities in investing in Africa because African markets are relatively small at the national level. We should continue to expand our efforts to expand African regional integration. Enhance U.S. investment in infrastructure. The Millennium Challenge Corporation has created a new model that requires a greater accountability and partnership with our African partner countries. However, one of the absences in MCC is the growth of subnational debt instruments. I believe MCC should devote, as I recommended 4 years ago in terms of regional funds, MCC should consider expending a portion of their funds to subnational infrastructure projects, because I believe that's often the greater, stronger relationship to build infrastructure. We need to continue to strengthen Africa's innovation and enabling business environments. That includes measures such as IPR protection, but also tax and financial incentives to really give Africa's innovation communities opportunity to grow. I believe that U.S. and sharing at almost the firm level, fostering exchanges such as the Global Entrepreneurship Forum, AGOA Forum, and others are an opportunity for us to expand at a firm-to-firm and innovator-to-innovator way, an opportunity for U.S. investment to flow. Let me close by saying that, and Congressman Yoho was going to testify or present at the Center for Global Development the other day, so I thought it was appropriate for me to mention that I believe that the instrumentalities and instruments provided by OPIC, EXIM, and TDA are important to continue and deepen our trade and investment relationships with Africa. Much to the contrary is believed, OPIC is a fundamental tool to really engender and gain the interest of small and medium enterprises in the United States, because only 8% of its services are used by Fortune 500 companies. I believe that OPIC and EXIM can provide a platform to improve and increase our trade and investment. And lastly, I think it would be remiss for me not to mention the important work of the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service, Foreign Agricultural Service, and domestic U.S. Department of Commerce offices to not only broadcast but even inform business communities about the myriad opportunities of trade and investment in Africa. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Tony. Ambassador? Ambassador Brigitty.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, distinguished members of the committee, good morning. My name is Ambassador Reuben Brigitty. I am the Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. Thank you very much for inviting me to testify this morning regarding U.S. interests in Africa. In my view, The bases of U.S. engagement with Africa in the near future should largely remain what they have been over the last 3 decades under both Republican and Democratic administrations. They include a commitment to broadening democratic governance, cooperating on matters of mutual security, strengthening healthcare systems, and supporting economic development. I have elaborated at length about U.S. priorities in Africa in an article entitled, quote, "The New Pan-Africanism, Implications for U.S. Policy in Africa," which was published in the journal Survival in the summer of 2016. I submit this article for the record.
Without objection.
However, I would like to use the bulk of my testimony this morning to emphasize that U.S. objectives in Africa cannot be realized with the dramatic and draconian cuts to the U.S. Department of State and the U.S. Agency for International Development, which have been proposed by the Trump administration. In the Office of Management and Budget's document, America First, a budget blueprint to make America great again, President Trump proposes, quote, "deep cuts to foreign aid," end quote. The President's 2018 budget request for the Department of State and USAID propose a staggering 28% reduction from the 2017 annualized continuing resolution level. Recent media reports suggest that Secretary of State Tillerson plans to have a reduction of 2,300 foreign and civil service officers, or nearly 10% of the State Department's professional workforce within the next 2 years. Mr. Chairman, let me say clearly and emphatically that such deep cuts to the Department of State and USAID budgets will cause unavoidable damage to African partners and to American interests on the continent. The presumption by the White House and the Secretary of State that the ranks of the Foreign Service can be dramatically reduced without harming the national interest of the United States is incorrect, particularly as it relates to Africa. As a former United States ambassador to the African Union and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, I can attest to the fact that diplomacy in Africa is a retail business. Perhaps more so than in other parts of the world, engaging directly and repeatedly with government officials, business people, and civic leaders is essential for building trust, gathering information, and advancing policies. It is self-evident that decreasing the number of diplomats available to serve in U.S. embassies abroad, to include Africa, will decrease our ability to shape events and advance our interests on the continent. This is made all the more problematic because U.S. embassies in Africa are already understaffed relative to our diplomatic missions in Europe. From Nouakchott to Nairobi, many circumstances exist to a greater or lesser degree at U.S. embassies across sub-Saharan Africa, where a relatively small number of diplomats, compared, for example, to our diplomatic footprint in Riga or Berlin, must work exceptionally hard to develop the relationships needed to advance U.S. interests. Whether it be finding a way to end the fighting in South Sudan or facilitating an eventual political transition in Zimbabwe, it is impossible to foresee how decreasing our diplomatic presence in Africa can contribute to those and other important objectives. The problem is perhaps even more tangible as it relates to proposed cuts to the USAID budget. With the breadth of challenges and scope of opportunities on the continent today, cutting the USAID budget will inevitably harm African partners and hurt American interests. It is self-evident that massive cuts to the USAID budget inevitably leading to the closure of USAID missions and the depletion of vital programs will cripple our ability to respond to these and other pressing challenges. Mr. Chairman, when I served as the U.S. ambassador to the African Union, I proudly often said that the United States was, quote, the natural partner of choice for Africa. If such draconian cuts to the Department of State and USAID are allowed to proceed, then we will abdicate our position of principled partnership with African governments. We will, in effect, have gift-wrapped the continent and handed it to China. We must not cede our position of partnership to China, which would surely happen if the Trump administration's damaging budget proposals are adopted. In conclusion, I commend the committee for examining the important issue of U.S. interests of Africa. And let me say as well that maintaining the capacity of USAID and the State Department to continue to engage is squarely in the interest of our country. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador Brigitty. I'm going to ask maybe 3 questions here dealing with poaching, dealing with trade, dealing with terrorism as it relates to State Department budget, USAID. These are programs that we've authored here, put into effect, just to look at the results of them. The first I'll mention to Mr. Christie here, if we looked at the headlines 6 weeks ago, we saw China had taken the lead here on shutting down the ivory market in China. The headline was, "Elephants Get Reprieve, Demand for Ivory Drops." And what was happening was the worldwide demand for ivory as a consequence of that decision, which they made after we passed the legislation, did give these species a reprieve in the sense that it dries up the demand. And so part of our legislation, besides helping on the ground with the park rangers, is the naming and shaming of those governments. You say that Sudan is a poaching super state, and Sudan doesn't have elephants of its own. Explain the role they're playing and what other countries you would name and shame as we put that list together, because the State Department is going to roll that out.
Sudan's role as a poaching superstate, I use that phrase to describe what is happening with groups supported by President Omar al-Bashir, who's wanted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. His Janjaweed, whom he supports, leave on horseback Darfur and sweep across the continent, killing elephants all the way across from Chad, all the way across to, in 2012, a massive killing of 650 elephants in Cameroon, Bubunjira Forest. He has given home and sustenance to Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army operating in the Kafia-Kingi enclave section of Darfur. The Sudanese Armed Forces are also poachers in Garamba National Park. And so, unlike any other state that I'm familiar with, this is government-sanctioned poaching that funds arms to these extremist groups, and it is in a country that has no elephants, so it is preying upon the rest of Africa. The naming and shaming of countries is a practice that has, I don't use that phrase, but it is a practice that has achieved important results in the ivory trafficking world. The so-called Gang of 8 countries that were named as ivory trafficking hotspots at the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species had enormous effect in pressuring those countries to make a difference. I would include those countries. I won't walk through them because I'm doubtless going to miss one or two. But to them, I would certainly add or include Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, these countries that will take the place of China as transit countries into China, as China does the admirable act of shutting down its ivory industry. I would look very significantly towards those demand countries.
Thank you, and that brought up a question that we should go to General Ward about, and that is Joseph Kony and his Lord's Resistance Army and terrorism, the terrorization of civilians across Uganda and South Sudan and Central Africa. What's your assessment? We passed legislation here some years ago giving you and giving our U.S. military the mission of assisting in this. Give us a quick assessment, if you will.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. The assistance that we provided to Uganda in particular, as well as other countries in the region, absolutely essential and provided a boost to the ability to limit Boko Haram the Lord's Resistance Army and Joseph Kony's ability to influence that region. It has paid off, I believe, in some very positive terms because his reach has been limited. His ability to wreak havoc in that region has been severely restricted. It's not over. It's not done. He still is there, but his ability to do what he had been doing, especially when you look at the time frame 2008, 9, 10, and 11, has been severely reduced as a result of the support that has been provided to the African militaries and security forces operating in that region.
Thank you, General. I had one last question for Mr. Carroll. This goes to the trade issue. We passed the Electrify Africa Act here. What have you seen on the continent as far as a lack of electricity and how it impacts economic growth and how this can reverse that situation on the ground?
Well, I think it's, of course, always dangerous to make overgeneralizations. Certain countries have done a better job, more coherent job in developing their power infrastructure, whereas other countries have fallen woefully short of the mark. Clearly, if Africa wants to expand its opportunities in manufacturing, in the growth of services sectors, which I believe it can aspire to, power is going to be an essential component of that. Power would certainly, alongside human resource development, will be, I think, important elements of Africa's economic future. So your efforts to not only expand U.S. corporate interests, but also, and I think it's important that we mention this, Mr. Chairman, to inspire Africans to take measures themselves to enhance and to make more coherent, incentivize investment in their power sector is certainly, I think, an essential step in their economic development.
Thank you. We go to Ranking Member Karen Bass of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for holding this hearing and also for all of the witnesses and your work over the years. You know, one of the things that I have appreciated over the last couple of years in this committee is legislation like you mentioned, Electrify Africa and also Feed the Future, which I believe begins to change the paradigm toward Africans doing for themselves. And in that regard, I wanted to ask the question both to General Ward and Ambassador Brigitty in terms of AFRICOM and U.S. military assistance to African countries, to African militaries and the AU to increase the continent's capacity to defend itself and peacekeeping, and also, you know, in a situation like happened in Mali a couple of years ago when there was a coup and they had to call on the former colonial power, they had to call on France. And so I wanted to know an assessment as to where we are and what more you think we need to do in terms of the U.S. military's assistance to the AU as well as African countries, and that's for both Ward and Brigitty.
Thank you, Congresswoman Bass. It's great to see you again, and thank you for all that you do, recognizing our interest in Africa as well. Appreciate that. With respect to the role of U.S. security assistance, military assistance to the African security forces, it has made a difference. It has caused many nations on the continent to increase their professionalism and, as importantly, to improve how they operate as militaries and civilian societies, abiding by the rule of law and acting in ways that are in keeping with our democratic principles with respect to the proper role of a military and a civilian society. It's not perfect. It's not perfect. And our efforts to continue to reinforce those, that the training that we provide, the work that's done to cause that additional professionalism to be present is certainly is important. I use the term sustained security engagement. These militaries weren't created in the way they were overnight, and they won't be corrected, i.e. righted in a way that we would like them to be overnight as well. So our sustained security engagement, just as is the case for sustained developmental engagement and sustained diplomatic engagement, are essential elements to continue the path that is a positive trajectory now that we see.
Thank you. And for Ambassador Brigitty.
Thank you, Congresswoman, again. Good to see you. From the diplomatic perspective, the most challenging aspect of African institutions providing for their own security has not been their will. Frankly, African forces have taken extraordinary risks. to engage the enemy in Somalia, in Central African Republic, and whatnot. The more difficult problem has been their desire and their capacity to fund themselves, as well as, frankly, the politics surrounding their own particular arrangements for their own collective security. And to answer your question about what the United States may do to further enhance that, I would say two things. The good news is that as of the last AU summit in Kigali last summer, the AU has adopted formally a number of mechanisms to help fund its own operations, broadly speaking, and then also as it relates to peacekeeping. One of the initiatives, as you and other members of the committee will know, towards the end of the Obama administration, was to partner with the African Union, in which the African Union would commit within 5 years to fund 25% of its own peacekeeping operations, so long as the United Nations would fund another 75% for those peacekeeping operations that were authorized by the UN Security Council. This is a watershed development, and I would urge both Congress and the Trump administration to continue it because in the long run, it is both in the interest of the United States as well as in the interests of Africans. The second problem set has had to do with, frankly, the political arrangements surrounding the African Standby Force, which, as you will know, is consisted of a series of 5 regional brigades. Politically, the difficulty within the African Union of advancing it has been some concerns among some African states that such a standing force could frankly be used as a method of regime change against other African countries. Sure. And my own view is that the best way the United States can support that effort is to stay out of it. Which is to say, to let the Africans resolve that process themselves, but when they do, to let them know that the United States and other organizations to which we belong, like NATO, will stand ready to be in full partnership with them to develop their military capabilities to address their own issues on the continent.
Thank you. And I've run out of time, but I would just like to ask the other two panelists, maybe you could get back to me in writing with Mr. Carroll in terms of our trade hubs, how they are working, and where else you think they need to be. And then, Mr. Christie, you referenced the legislation that was passed last year on wildlife trafficking. I would like to know how that's working and what more you think we could do here. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Congresswoman Bass. We go to Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our very distinguished witnesses for your service and for your testimonies today. It's very, very helpful to all of us. Since we only have a limited amount of time, General Ward, I'd like to just discuss a couple of things with you. Thank you again for your inaugural commander, your leadership at AFRICOM. We've spoken before, and it's great to see you again. I'd like to ask you just 2 questions, 2 areas. The first is on the training of individuals, Leahy-vetted individuals, military men and women. In my subcommittee, the Africa subcommittee, we tried for years to promote the training of Nigerian military. Greg Simpkins and I, our chief of staff, traveled twice to Abuja. We went to Jos, where a lot of the churches have been firebombed with Archbishop Kegama. Long story short, there was this reluctance and more reluctance to train, aggressively train in counterinsurgency those men and women that the Nigerians wanted to do. I held a number of hearings on it. In one particular hearing, we found out that 187 Nigerian units and 173 police units would be fully Leahy-vetted. They were clear and could be trained. And again, I asked question after question about that. We had full committee hearings on it as well, all because we wanted the Nigerians, who have a very capable military, to have that very special training to take it to Boko Haram and defeat that insidious enemy. I'm always wondering, again, what the interface is with AFRICOM on that, because I know the military, when we would meet with the military people in Abuja, they were gung-ho. They can take it to them and they can defeat them. And obviously, Boko Haram got worse and worse by the year and stronger. Secondly, on the issue of trafficking, in the year 2000, I wrote the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, our landmark law on combating trafficking. We wrote into the standards that judges countries as to how poorly or well they're doing on combating trafficking, how well their militaries are doing. We contacted the Bush administration in 2001. He stood up a zero-tolerance policy, combatant commanders are to have people, as you know so well, that work on trafficking. My question would be, and we've talked about this before, how is AFRICOM able to promote aggressively the idea of zero tolerance in trafficking in the militaries of Africa? It seems to me, the peer-to-peer contact, more than anybody at state or anybody in Congress, could have a very effective impact on they taking up those best practices that the U.S. military has honed so well. General.
Thank you, Congressman, and I'll be brief as I respond to your 2 points here. Firstly, with respect to the reluctance of Nigeria to do what it did. On the one hand, our association with the Nigerian military, such that they are responding to their civilian authorities, works. And therein lies, from my perspective, where the problem was, because the political environment prohibited the Nigerian military from doing all that those leaders and others that you indicated would certainly want to do from doing. It even had an impact on my ability to engage during my time as commander there in Nigeria because of a political environment that just restricted our presence and our involvement. So my estimation, that was the problem at that time. I'm happy to say that that is no longer the case as it was, and the level of interaction is enhanced and improving, and I believe the training that we can offer, support the training assistance, is in fact the training assistance that makes sense for them. And therein lies into the second question with respect to trafficking. The more we are engaged and involved, our U.S. service members, be they sailors, soldiers, airmen, Marines, are true ambassadors for America. And when our young women and men are with the military and security forces of these other nations, they tend to adopt more rather than less our habits, if you will, and those are habits that respect the rights of individuals, where those militaries are seen as protectors of their people across the gamut, and the issue of zero tolerance for trafficking is seen as not something we do. We are here to protect our people as opposed to oppressing them. And the more we are engaged to include through programs like IMET, which is that long-term engagement, help to reinforce those ideals amongst the military members of our partner friends.
Out of time. Thank you so very much, General, and thank you, all of you.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. We now go to Brad Sherman of California.
Mr. Carroll, our economy is about 7 times the size of France, yet they export $1.50 worth of goods to Africa for each dollar we export. What are they doing right or we're doing wrong? And in particular, are our embassies doing as much as they should to promote American exports? I would note that Germany even exports more to Africa than we do. France may have an advantage because of its prior colonial status. Germany has no such advantage. How do we export more?
Well, with reference to France, Mr. Congressman, you of course do mention that there are many historic relationships of a commercial nature. One thing that struck me about observing the French relationship with Africa in a commercial sense is they take it at a very, very high level, even to the office of the president. There has been an historic relationship between the presidency and their former African colonies, and as you know, the French system of corporations tends to run very closely along political lines. So there's many, shall we say, buttons to push that engage and enlarge that Franco-African relationship. I could talk a lot about that, but I'll just say that it's an historic one. I think that we could do more at the embassy level. I was certainly encouraged over the expansion of the U.S. Commerce Department's offices and presence in Africa, because I believe that these foreign commercial service offices can really go out and identify not only market opportunities, but to also play a particularly strong role, Mr. Sherman, in assisting small and medium enterprise U.S. companies that may not have.
Mr. Carroll, I've got to go on to another question. It's just been my experience that foreign ministries of other countries put a lot more political pressure and effort into exports than our State Department.
Vraiment.
Ambassador, we're seeing a humanitarian disaster in South Sudan. Some have suggested an arms embargo, but that might just leave the Nuer at the tender mercies of President Kiir. What often when you can't create an atmosphere of peace, you can at least create a balance of power and separation of warring parties. What can we do so that we don't see a slaughter of the Nuer people and that we restore peace to South Sudan?
Congressman, thank you for the question. First of all, as we know, very briefly, almost all of our normal interventions have failed. Not only those of ourselves, but also those of EGAD, the Regional Economic Community, and others. And to be frank, the leaders of both the government and the opposition have become masters at manipulating the outside negotiators, and they are not serious about peace, nor are they frankly serious about the welfare of their own people. In my view, Congressman, South Sudan, the leaders of South Sudan have lost their legitimacy and also lost their right to sovereignly govern their country. If ever there were a place in the world that were ripe for renewed UN trusteeship, it is South Sudan.
That being the case, is this a matter of creating a balance of power between two forces led by evil men, or is this something where we can't accomplish anything unless we with our allies in Africa can go in on the ground and restore order?
I believe that the current leadership of South Sudan must be replaced.
Gotcha.
Preferably with indictments in front of the ICC.
I would point out, though, that I don't see any country with the stomach to. It's one thing to indict in Europe at the ICC. It's another thing to serve those indictments on the leaders of the two sides in South Sudan and to compel their attendance. And I don't know if the world has a willingness to send troops in to achieve that. I've got just a few more seconds, and I want to make a point that not only do we see a terrible budget, as you indicated, but there's a complete failure to appoint anybody. We do, as I understand it, we don't have an Assistant Secretary for Africa, and we don't have an acting Assistant Secretary for Africa, really, because the person we have filling that job doesn't have the qualifications, the technical legal qualifications, to even be called acting assistant. Anything we can do to get some people over there?
We might ask the Trump administration to appoint someone yesterday, because it is vital that we move quickly in this regard.
Yes, and I'd point out these are not appointments pending in the Senate. These are appointments they just haven't gotten to. And if they just perhaps let the Secretary of State make these appointments, we could go forward rather than having White House Personnel Office deal with them, and I yield back.
We go now to Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much, and let me just note that our chairman has taken an interest in Africa since he came here. I remember I was surprised. We both come from Orange County, California, and I was surprised when he came here that he became so dedicated to looking and making sure that Africans' needs were met and that we were paying attention to what was going on there. And he's been doing that for 20 years now, so there you go. And I'd like to bring up an issue that perhaps it touches on everything we've been saying, but it's something that nobody seems to ever look at. And, you know, we have here a situation where you have millions of people living, millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people living in abject poverty. The level of human suffering as compared to other places on the planet is probably the worst, if not probably the worst. Human suffering is going on in Africa. And yet, Africa is a continent that is so rich in resources. I mean, it is obviously there is a vast wealth associated with the fundamentals of resources in Africa. But yet, hundreds of millions of people living in desperate lives. And I will have to say that it is not their fault, obviously. It's the fault of a system. And what part of the system, now, what we haven't really talked about, what people don't talk about, is what I happen to believe is an important part of the system in a way, and without it, all these maladies, the bad guys that are exploiting and causing this deprivation of so many people would not be able to succeed without this element. And here it is. All of these things, what you said, our friend from the National Geographic study, Mr. Christie, your video showed all these guys with the ivory and such. Don't they have to have a bank to put that money into? Aren't these leaders in these various leaders in these countries and the various political people there stealing money and putting it in Western banks? Isn't the financial community in some way responsible when it takes billions of dollars of graft, of ivory money, and of money from people who're stealing it from these poor countries, the leaders of those countries? Aren't we talking about the global financial system here? What responsibility do they play in this? And that's my question for the whole panel. I will go first with our friend Christie, because I mentioned it.
Thank you very much, Congressman. For the worst groups, the groups operating in the most violent groups operating in Central Africa, they operate primarily on a barter system. So they are trading ivory for arms, and in the case of the LRA and the Janjaweed, that to the extent there's a money face to that is really going to Khartoum, Sudan, the Sudanese government.
Yeah, right, but
you're absolutely right. That
even if they're trading for arms, eventually somebody's paying for those arms, right?
Right.
I mean, we're talking about a system here, and the system, I believe, ends up with billions of dollars in somebody's bank where they are able to use that money for whatever bankers use it for.
As a criminal investigator, I look for weak nodes. So I look for places where if you're moving product, you have to bring it up in a port. You can take it out of the jungle, we can't find you there. You can sell it to a consumer in the Chinese market, we can't find you there, but we can find you at the port where it has to emerge. And the financial system is a similar opportunity. You're putting your finger on financial crimes, and the End Wildlife Trafficking Act gets to some of this appropriately, that there is a financial aspect, a money laundering aspect, and it is worth exploring.
Do you have a comment on else? I've got 9 seconds left. Well, Mr. Chairman, I would suggest, and I know this is a very delicate thing, but I think we need to have some focus and a hearing on the role that international financial institutions are playing in problems like this. Because I believe the people of Africa are being robbed, and their accomplice in this crime are Western banks.
I think that if the gentleman would yield.
Yes.
I remember a conversation I had with a bank executive where I raised this issue in Europe about money that was held by Charles Taylor. And I made the allegation that $30 million was held in that particular institution. And I remember this executive saying, "It's not $30 million, we have $23 million," which astounded me. But nevertheless, we gave that information to the Treasury Department. But it's certainly the case that if we could create more transparency, and I would say that this most applies to heads of state and to senior government officials, cabinet officials, and so forth. If we had that kind of transparency out of the financial system, where at a certain level that information became available, I think it would be a disincentive all over the world. for those involved in bad governance, at that point, it's probably better if you're the head of state or an executive to go ahead and slap your name on a hospital and build that for your people, rather than transfer it out of the country with the knowledge that that might be exposed and taken from you. It's probably a better legacy to at least spend it internally in the country. And I think moving forward, the gentleman raises a good point. We should work with the international community on a strategy that creates disincentives with respect to kleptocracy. We go now to Mr. Gregory Meeks of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to agree with Mr. Robacher on two things. One, what you're talking about with reference to the banks, but two, the extraordinary dedication and focus you've had, Mr. Chairman, as chairman of the subcommittee at one point, and now as chairman of the committee. You've taken a number of us over to visit, and you have had a real focus and attention on Africa. I want to thank you for that, and of course, the extraordinary contributions that the ranking member of the subcommittee has had on Africa. You know, and somebody mentioned two names that need to be mentioned anytime that I think of Africa, long before I came to Congressman. That's Congressman Charles Rangel and Congressman Donald Payne Sr. And surely we miss them, but I know and just want to make sure the extraordinary work that Congresswoman Bass has made, because we thought that there was going to be a huge vacuum when we lost, but she's made sure that that has not happened, and I want to thank her for her focus. Let me also thank all of the panelists, particularly, well, all of you, but particularly to General Ward for your service to the United States of America and what you have done and the commitment that you've made to this country, and to Ambassador Brigitty for because I couldn't agree with you more. You know, when we look at the State Department, it is tremendously important to our foreign affairs. In fact, I say the military and the State Department, you know, it's the balance of the scale that makes foreign policy works. With one, without the other, we are in deep, I won't say the word, but but I just wanted to thank you so much for that. So let me just ask two quick questions, one to Ambassador Brigitty. I couldn't agree more with your opening statement. Maybe you could articulate the dangers of some of the programs that you think that would be devastated, that are so important to our for our State Department with reference to working with Africa, and maybe you can articulate a few of those programs.
Thank you, Congressman. So the budget document that was submitted by the President says that there would be no decrease in funding for health, in particular for PEPFAR, neither would there be any decrease in humanitarian accounts. So if one accepts that proposition, but then also suggests that there has to be some massive cuts somewhere if you want to achieve that objective, there are two accounts that I am particularly worried about. The first is with regard to our democracy and governance accounts, particularly both those accounts per se, but also our economic support funds that can be used, broadly speaking, to support that. The African continent, with 54 sovereign members that are recognized by the UN, 55 when you include Western Sahara, could be the largest democratic region in the world, both because of the number of countries there, as well as because of the commitment to democracy in the Pan-African documents themselves. But as the chairman noted, there are democracies under assault across the continent. And if the United States does not step up to be a partner with Pan-African institutions as well as national governments, there's not another major partner in the world that will be similarly positioned, both in terms of resources it can apply and also in terms of its value set, to continue to support the march towards democracy at a time when the Chinese and others are suggesting to other African elites that there is an alternative model for governance, namely essentially various forms of authoritarianism, which would be tragic. So the second thing I'm really worried about is the Mandela Washington Fellowship Program, or YALI, which has been an incredible tool in the very short period of time it has existed, both to identify young African talent and also to find ways to encourage that young African talent to engage in their own countries and to teach them and to help expose them to means of Western governance, of Western political engagement and whatnot. And I can promise you, in an environment where Young Africans are looking for ways to fulfill their aspirations. We want them to be looking towards us and not elsewhere.
Thank you. I also just want you to know that you must have been great at the State Department. I've got Madalena Young-Smith now with me for a while, and she's excellent, too. Mr. Carroll, I want to ask you a quick question. What investment opportunities that may be going unrealized for U.S. firms, what would you look at and say that there's other opportunities that we may be able to take advantage of that they're not currently taking advantage of?
Well, I'll just mention too, sir. I think in the area of engineering and design services, I think the U.S. Firms have an awful lot to offer, and I think they're often in the second-tier firms that might have real strengths in providing those services to Africa. So I do think in the design and engineering and architecture field, I think there's a lot of service opportunities in Africa. But also in agribusiness, sir, I do believe that Africa is at a pivot. I think its future will be to have to modernize, to learn some of the lessons of the Green Revolution of India, and I think American agribusiness companies that, particularly those that offer technology such as irrigation systems, inputs, farm and herd management solutions, are going to find Africa to be a massive opportunity because Africa has the largest percentage of undeveloped arable land in the entire globe.
We go now to Mike McCall, Chairman Mike McCall of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I chair the Homeland Security Committee. One thing I've found time and time again is that terrorism thrives in failed states, in poverty, in safe havens. Unfortunately, Africa has many of those as we look at Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. And I think we've made some progress. Millennium Challenge has been helpful. The Gates Foundation, I've met with Bill Gates. The One Campaign is trying to move forward in this development of Africa. My first question, Generals, to you. I visited Camp North in the Sinai Peninsula, where ISIS is prevalent. Then went to Tunisia, visited with the Libyan team. Libya is still very much a strong threat to the homeland in terms of the number of ISIS, as is Sinai. General Haftar in the east, and then you have General Siraj in Tripoli. It seems to me if the military can't get it together, then you can't have governance, and if you can't have governance, then you have terrorism. Can you tell us where we are with that, and what can we do more to foster a unified government in Libya?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman McCall. And obviously, my understanding of it is from a position of afar, not directly involved these days. However, there are some things that I think are substantially important to moving along in these regions that you've described. To be sure, fragile states, failing states are breeding grounds for nefarious activities of all sorts: human trafficking, narcotics trafficking, certainly terrorist havens for training and exporting that violence globally. Where we, as the United States of America, are involved in a sustained way to, one, help security forces who are responsible for their own territories be better prepared to do that, makes a difference. Equally important is our engagement from a developmental perspective to cause those who are living in those areas to see what I call this horizon of hope, because where they are, there are things being done for them by their government and by those who would support their attempts to have things provided from a literacy perspective, from a health perspective, that will help increase their ability to live the way that we, as any human being, would want to live.
And I agree, but how do we get these two generals to work it out? I mean, that seems to be the key problem in Libya to me.
I'll be happy to have a private conversation with you about that.
We have a skiff in the Capitol.
But the essence, sir, is causing their behavior to change, similar to what we see in South Sudan. And until that happens, making progress will be very, very difficult. So causing their behavior to change so that they are less selfishly motivated and motivated for the good of the country,
Thank you.
opposed to not.
Mr. Christie, so terrorist financing, this is really quite horrific. They're using ivory to finance terrorism in Africa, and I commend what you've done to try to track this down. Can you tell us about the wildlife trafficking bill that this committee passed, how that is helping in this effort, and what more can we do to shut down? And we know that there's cocaine coming in from South America, you know, on the west coast of Africa to funnel and finance this as well. But tell us about the impact of that legislation and what more can we do?
Thank you, Congressman. I think you know, all of this takes more time than we want. That bill was the law was signed, I think, in October of 16. So it's really too early to tell the impact. Certainly, identifying the countries is the next step. The problem countries as traffickers, and that has proved in the ivory world to be significant. So. To take it the next step and identify countries that are linked with extremist groups and the trafficking in these materials, ivory, rhino horn, et cetera, will be significant. The world needs diplomatic pressure on these countries to address these problems. These groups, I mean, one of the things that where we could make a big improvement is to look at the ways we've siloed these problems. So we tend to look at wildlife trafficking as a wildlife problem, and we think it's the aegis of biologists to address. We don't do that with cocaine. We don't put botanists in charge of the cocaine trafficking problem. If we move out of the biologist mindset and move to law enforcement mindset, we begin to change how we think about these problems. We begin to say, so as an example, I was in Garamba National Park, which has been under siege from South Sudanese poachers, LRA, all these bad guys in this area. And I looked at the maps that they had for tracking the poaching groups. And then and they very detailed maps that they pin every day, update. And I had the opportunity to fly over to Central African Republic and spend time with the African Union forces there. And I noticed they had similar maps. And they overlapped, and they had pins in those maps, and with different poacher and extremist group movements. And I said, do you guys talk to each other? No. And so I introduced them, and they began talking, and they had some suspicions about the activities of the other. They the park rangers suspected the Ugandan military was poaching from helicopters. So two things happened. One, we were able to clear up that, to their satisfaction, and two, they could begin exchanging intel, and that sort of intelligence sharing is critically important.
I'm well beyond my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. David Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to thank you for your long-time commitment to Africa and the great leadership you've provided, and also acknowledge the extraordinary passionate and effective leadership of our ranking member of the subcommittee, Karen Bass, who has made her work in this area known not only throughout our country, but throughout the region, and I really want to thank her for that. General Ward, I want to ask you, there are currently 9 UN peacekeeping missions deployed to various parts of the African continent, constituting more than 82% of all UN peacekeepers serving in the field. Peacekeeping operations, as you know, are some of the most visible and consequential activities undertaken by the UN and play a very important role in advancing peace and security. And I'm interested to know, given your experience as AFRICOM's commander, whether, what you would say in terms of the role of peacekeepers in terms of peace and security in Africa, and particularly in your experience, what makes some peacekeeping operations more successful than others, and are there best practices that we should be analyzing and incorporating to future missions so that we can even enhance the effectiveness of peacekeeping missions further?
Thank you, Congressman. 2 critical elements to effective peacekeeping. One is obviously being resourced and trained appropriately in order to conduct the mission. The second has to do with the will of the government that provides the peacekeeping forces and how that is infused into the conduct of those peacekeeping forces as they execute the mission. When you have those two, and obviously it's all underwritten by a mandate that allows what needs to be done to in fact be done. But if those forces are resourced and trained adequately, and the government will to accomplish the mission is there, then peacekeeping forces are effective, and there were varying degrees of that I witnessed across the continent. I would also add, Congressman, while we're talking about the peacekeeping in and of itself is one dimension of providing that stability and security. If it is not accompanied by a healthy dose of developmental support, such that the peacekeeping void, if it's not filled, can be created or corrected and filled by something that makes sense to the people, then that peacekeeping effort goes on and on and on, which is all we also see. So peacekeeping in and of itself is one piece of it, one aspect of it, but the void, the requirement for development, assistance, support, progress, and that certainly has the underlying effect of governance as well, so that those things support it. Will, forces that are trained, resources are important.
Thank you very much. That sort of gets to my next question, and this is for you, Mr. Carroll. In recent years, we've witnessed a narrowing of political space in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, and the Republic of the Congo. This has been coupled with efforts by many of these leaders to extend their tenures in power through constitutional coups, which eliminate term limits for the incumbent. What are the concrete measures the State Department and USAID should be taking to support democratic institutions and help reverse this worrying trend? And a related question, how should African leaders' amendment or circumvention of constitutional term limits impact U.S. bilateral aid in your judgment?
Well, I think we should continue to work with institutions in the countries that we can work with. They could include the media, they could include the legislative branch, they could include civil society organizations that we believe can bring domestic as well as external leverage. Because I think it's got to be not just us, we've got to have domestic sources in the fight. But from a business perspective, if you don't mind, Mr. Congressman, I find that unpredictability in the business environment is one of the greatest discouragements to foreign direct investment. And I think we in the business community and through perhaps our local counterparts and business associations need to carry that message, that if you're going to want to do business with us, if you're going to want to attract technology and investment, we need to have a measure of predictability in these countries. Congo is a perfect case in point, a country with vast mineral and agricultural potential that largely goes undeveloped because of this issue of unpredictability.
Great, thank you so much. I want to just one last question for you, Mr. Ambassador. One very concerning trend during political protests and elections in sub-Saharan Africa is that the governments have shut down access to the internet and other forms of communication in order to limit dissent. This has recently occurred in Ethiopia, Gabon, Cameroon, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, making it very difficult for citizens and journalists to report human rights violations or electoral irregularities. I'd be interested to know what actions you think our government should take to mitigate this threat to the freedom of information and legitimate political expression in the sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you, Congressman. Very briefly, the first obvious one is for robust engagement with those governments to demonstrate to them why it's crucially important, notwithstanding political differences, to continue to have open media space. Because at the end of the day, if people are not allowed to air their grievances peacefully, they will do so forcefully. And I think that clearly is the lesson in Ethiopia, for example. And then secondarily, depending on the situation, there are obviously tools and techniques that are resident within USAID and also with civil affairs units to be able to make access to internet available on a sort of more regional or smaller scale basis. But even those things, as I said in my testimony, require resources, and I think it's important to continue to fund those things.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. We go to Ted Yoho from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, panel, for being here. Very engaging, and I really appreciate it. And I know a lot of the talks focused on cutting foreign aid. And I was one of those ones when I came up here 4 years ago to get rid of foreign aid. But I've become much more learned in my 4 years here. And, you know, I realize and I agree with Secretary Mattis that says if you cut foreign aid, save that money and buy ammunition with it. And I truly believe that. But I bring that up because we are in a financial crisis in this country that is going to get worse if we don't deal with the underlying problem, which is mandatory spending, and we have to address those things. And if not, what you're seeing today is a sign, it's a tremor. I got a report at the beginning of the year that said our seniors in Social Security were going to get a 25% cut across the board on Social Security checks within 12 years. And when it comes down to our seniors or foreign aid, you know where it's going to go. So I say that because you guys are the ones that are directing foreign aid in some capacity. You are the ones that need to make sure that our money on the ground is doing the work it's supposed to be. And our goal, my goal, is to transition all of our countries that we're giving foreign aid to go from a model of aid to trade. And that's why I'm so excited about the OPEC models and the MCC. They have accountability. They have metrics in place. And as good as they are, we need to make them better. And if we look at our top 15 trading partners, 12 of those were recipient of foreign aids. I think South Korea is a great example, and we can look at country after country that has done the same thing. And so with that, several questions came up. What is the major impediment in these developing countries to build out their infrastructure? You know, we went to the Congo with Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel. And if you look at the whole continent of Africa, it's approximately 1.11 billion people. This is the 21st century. 650 million people do not have electricity. And we are strong proponents of Electrify Africa, the Global Food Initiative, and the other bills that Chairman Royce spoke about. 650 million people don't have electricity. And you look at the billions and billions of dollars this nation has invested of these people's monies out here and the trillions of dollars around the world, what is that major impediment that you see that prevents a country from taking care of their own people instead of taking care of the rulers of that? How do we change that too? So the impediment, and what do you see? Ambassador Brigitty, if you would.
Congressman, thank you very much. Let me begin by saying that as a taxpayer myself, of course, I obviously believe very much in the effective stewardship of American taxpayer dollars. And as with every program, there are obviously ways in which they can continue to be refined and efficiencies found and things of that nature. But at the same time, one also has to make sure that we are making effective investments for not only for the nature of our security, but also for the growth of our partners. With regard to infrastructure investments, broadly speaking, I think it goes something to what my colleague Tony Carroll said, which is, one, infrastructures are long-term, big-picture investments. And as one senior investor once told me, capital is cowardly. It does not want to go to places where there is substantial insecurity. So in this sense, the nature of good governance to ensure both a stable, sort of peaceful environment as well as a stable regulatory environment is vital towards attracting the sort of long-term capitals necessary to build infrastructure. The second also is, frankly, having willing investors that are prepared to take risks, notwithstanding what I just said about insecurity. And the Chinese have proven that it can be done. The Ethiopians have proven that it can be done in terms of marshaling capital for the Grand Renaissance Ethiopian Dam. And I'm one who happens to believe that the future of Africa's next chapter of their history will be defined by private sector-led economic development. And as somebody, as a diplomat who constantly thinks through foreign policy implications, I can also tell you that we simply cannot be able to maintain our position of partnership with the continent without the robust involvement of the American private sector, particularly as it relates to American.
Well, and that's what I like about OPEC, because they put the metrics and they'll fund those organizations or the private sector. And if you look at in 1961, the majority of the foreign investment in countries was foreign governments. Today, that's only 9%. The rest is coming from foreign government, private sector. And Mr. Carroll, you were talking about, oh shoot, I forgot what I was going to say. You were talking about, the investment with OPEC and how we can make that more effective in those countries. Can you expound just a little bit? I only got 4 seconds, so I guess you can't.
We have 2 seconds. I think that we can do more leveraging with domestic capital. I think there are many pension funds and other institutions that on a national and regional level that OPIC could do more work for and do a little bit more leveraging. We can have a separate discussion, or I can respond to other questions along those ideas.
Appreciate your time. Thank you all.
We go now to Dr. Ami Bera of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll echo the statements of many of my colleagues in the leadership that the chairman of the full committee and certainly the leadership of the ranking member of the subcommittee on Africa and Human Rights has shown. You know, this morning I had the opportunity to address the Meridian International Center's Global Dialogue with African Women Leaders, and in those comments, and in the conversation that we had, the importance of recognizing the global interconnectedness, that we can no longer think of ourselves as isolated. And I look at this from the perspective as a physician. You have public health crises that occur in Africa. They clearly matter to what happens here in the United States. And from that public health perspective, you don't wait until it hits our shores. You make those investments and you go to the epicenter and address that. So, with that, I was listening to my colleague, Mr. Yoho's comments, and I agree with him that, we have to be fiscally sound and make sure we're making the right investments, but the return on investments are also incredibly important. In that sense, when we think about our three planks of our foreign policy, it's got three legs on it, not just defense, but it's got diplomacy and development. And that development component often is overlooked because, yes, you might be spending $1 today, but what you're doing is potentially avoiding $10 in defense costs or public health costs, or the toll, how do you put a price on a human life? So, I applaud President Bush and his initiatives in PEPFAR, had huge returns, returns on the saving of life. Ambassador Brigitty, you served in the State Department during the 2011 famine in East Africa, and also as our representative to the African Union during the 2014 Ebola crisis. You've touched on, this is not the time for the United States to change its priorities and withdraw from a region. And I'd be curious, knowing that we're facing another potentially devastating crisis and famine and loss of life in the coming years, what would you advise us at this juncture?
Well, Congressman, thank you very much for the thoughtful question. There's both, I think, an obvious and then a less obvious answer. The obvious answer is that we clearly need to be continuing to support our health accounts and our humanitarian assistance accounts for the sorts of interventions that were necessary, for example, to respond to the 2011 famine in Somalia as well as the 2014 Ebola crisis. But the less obvious component is that there are profound diplomatic interventions that make that kind of response possible. Let me give you an example. During the 2014 Ebola crisis, I lost years off my life in helping to respond to that crisis because by the summer of 2014, we were seriously looking at epidemiological curves that would say we'd have 1 million dead Africans in 6 months by January, unless we were able to flood the zone of Liberia, Guinea-Conakry, and Sierra Leone with healthcare workers to actually respond to the crisis. So we did a lot of behind-the-scenes diplomatic work to get the African Union in the fight so that by December of that year, they had nearly 1,000 healthcare workers from across the continent that converged on those three countries to provide direct patient support to people that were affected. Now, the Africans deserve enormous credit for stepping up, but frankly, it would have taken, at a minimum, a lot longer to do so had we not done a lot of deft diplomacy behind the scenes that nobody ever saw. And we are already at the next time with regard to Ebola in the DRC. And as regards to the three unfolding famines on the continent, which is why it is so critical for us to be able to maintain that capability to develop the kind of trust that is necessary with our African partners so we can respond to these crises.
Wonderful. So, and I think of America as a great nation, but it's also that idea of America, those values that we represent. And a great nation, when they see famine, when they see public health crisis, doesn't retreat from the world. A great nation leads with our moral values, right? We see the humanitarian crisis, we see the public health crisis, and we lead. And it's that idea of America that we have to hold on to, that idea of American leadership that, for generations, folks have believed in. And, as I listen to these African women leaders, that is what their worry is, that, yes, we've got domestic challenges here, But you know what? It's that idea of who we are as a nation, that greatness. We can't let that disappear. Thank you, and I'll yield back.
We go now to Dan Donovan of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for my tardiness. I had another matter, but some of these questions may have been asked already. I am a member of the subcommittee that deals with Africa and global health of our larger committee. And maybe because 2 weeks after I was elected to this office, at 58 years old, I had my very first baby. Her mother actually calls her my very last baby. I got this great interest, being honored to serve on this committee that deals with global health, about women and children who are dying from preventable diseases, things that we have vaccinations for that for some reason or another are either unavailable or we can't get to mothers and babies who are suffering in African countries. I understand we've gotten better at it over the years, but there still seems to be some obstacles. And I don't know who the proper person on the panel is to answer this question, but if somebody could just give me some insight on how successful you feel we've been and what can we do to be even further along in our success in helping mothers and babies in Africa.
If I might jump in here, because I've done a fair amount of work with the Gates Foundation, polio in Nigeria, and continue to do a lot of work with Merck, the world's largest vaccine company, in their projects in Africa. I think it can't happen without building the health infrastructure in these countries. Many of these countries spend $4 to $6 per person per year on their health. Without developing a fulsome health infrastructure, any vaccination campaign, any type of preventative mechanism will not be successful. And it has to be led from leaders within that country, not just an externally led foreign assistance program. But I think it can happen. Certainly the success in polio eradication in Nigeria is an ongoing battle, but they've achieved a lot of success. In Rwanda, they instituted an HPV vaccine program in Rwanda that produced incredible adherence among Rwandan women. I believe that cervical cancer is among the 2 largest killers of women in Africa, and the only magic bullet we have in the world of vaccines is the HPV vaccine, which is extremely effective. They made a commitment to build out their infrastructure. They made a commitment from the top down that this is an important program. So we have to engage leadership in getting the message. We have to build them, help them build the infrastructure to staff and implement these programs. And we're not going to get it done if we're cutting the Fogarty Center and other CDC programs that are absolutely linchpins to these programs in Africa. We have to be able to be at their side, but it still has to be led from those countries. So thank you for that opportunity.
Congressman, if I may add to that, and I'm grateful for your passion on this issue. The issue with regard to building healthcare infrastructure in Africa is that it's not like building a bridge, where once it's built, it's done and you can walk away. These are essential, they're more like sort of living organisms in the sense that you have to continue to train new healthcare workers, one has to continue to deal with access and extension services into rural areas or whatnot. And this is why it's critically important for the United States to be able to maintain its capacity to help develop the long-term infrastructure of healthcare systems in African countries. The Ebola crisis, I think, is very instructive in this regard. So we had been involved for many years in helping to develop the healthcare infrastructure in Liberia, for example, which is focused not only on primary care, but also in helping to address HIV/AIDS. With the advent of the Ebola crisis and its coming to Monrovia, the healthcare system in Liberia was devastated. And by that we mean doctors, nurses, in which we'd invested many years, died and were no longer there. So the ability for us to continue to help train and educate and provide more and more healthcare officials, not only is something that has to be sustained over time, but sustaining it is clearly in our own national interest, in addition to what it does for mothers and children in those countries. Because the next time there is another major pandemic on the continent, we can't just insert a healthcare infrastructure. One has to develop it over time.
Mr. Ambassador, could you, I don't know what some of the causes, do we find that the governments in the African countries are cooperative as well? Or are there people that, are there regimes, are there governments that are trying to prevent their citizens from receiving the aid that we're so willing to provide?
Congressman, I'm not aware of any African country that is not willing to partner on matters of health. In most places, it is a matter of resources, to be frankly, and it also may be a matter of prioritization of resources. So it might be, for example, concentrating the decision whether or not you concentrate health services in the capital city versus extension services in rural areas, or focusing more on primary care as opposed to care for tertiary diseases like diabetes or cancer or other sorts of things.
Mr. Donovan, a quick postscript, if I might, Chair. Healthcare facilities on the continent of Africa are not the Walter Reed National Military Center at Bethesda. Quick example, in Comoros, where the USAID had a program where they were training local medical providers, we were able to partner with our USAID counterparts and using Department of Defense engineers build a concrete block structure whereby medical practice could be accomplished, and providing clean water to that facility facilitated the provision of a health service that community did not have previously and changed the whole dynamic in that community. And these are the things that this 1% of our national budget that goes to promoting our international assistance abroad creates feelings, creates a sentiment, creates the result that pays dividends on and on and on and helps to stabilize those environments.
It's a great example of our successes. The last thing I just want, because my time is way over as well. My colleague was talking about investment in Africa, private investment. I met with a group, and my staff can supply you with their information yesterday, called Rendezvous, who are developing planned communities in 7 African countries. So I just offer that to you if you'd like to hear more about it. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield whatever time I don't have any left.
Thank you, Mr. Donovan. We go to Norma Torres from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our guest panelists here today. General Ward, in your testimony, you made a very compelling case for why U.S. engagement in Africa is in our national interest, and I very much agree with you on that. Ambassador Brigitty, you've also made a point, and I want to share with you that the point that you made on the Ebola crisis. This point was driven home for many of our constituents during the Ebola crisis in 2014 and 2015. We have had a really great conversation here. I'm new to the committee, and I'm trying to wrap my hands around all of these issues. We've talked about ivory being used to finance terrorism and these civil wars. The one thing that we have not talked about, unfortunately, is how rape is being used also against women, against very young women in this continent. Projected U.S. global health funding for 2017 is an estimated $9.5 billion, all of which is subject to President Trump's global gag rule. So let's talk about that for a little bit. Every year, despite increased access to safe abortion procedures, 6 million African women end their pregnancies unsafely, and 1.6 million are treated for complications. So when we talk about safety and we talk about saving, these wonderful animals, what are we doing to help our young women in Africa? And how are we helping to ensure that there is a healthcare system in place to help them get the necessary procedures that they need, whether that is family planning, or what are we doing to teach them how to protect themselves from these abusers?
Congressman, thank you very much for that very important question. Both as a Deputy Assistant Secretary and also as an ambassador, I could spend days telling you about stories that I've encountered meeting women who are rape victims in Eastern Congo, refugee women in northern Kenya, et cetera, that have experienced exceptional trauma. And I've been very proud of the types of assistance that the United States has provided over time to address rape as a war crime, to provide services to help rape victims recover from these challenges. With regard to your question about the global gag rule, let me say, Congresswoman, that I understand that the question of abortion is an incredibly sensitive one with deep feelings on both sides of the debate, one that we will not resolve here. But one thing that is absolutely accurate is that the nature of the global gag rule, as articulated in its expansion of the Trump under the Trump administration, will have negative, harsh, unintended consequences for women who desperately need gynecological care. And it seems to me that if one is morally motivated with regard to the protection of life and compassion for those that are suffering, one would try at a minimum to find a way, as you address these incredibly challenging moral questions, that one does not harm those women that are in desperately need of the kinds of services that we provide.
They're victims in two separate ways.
May I add?
Please.
So one of the things I was excited about bringing to the fore today was that this, when we're talking about these wildlife crime issues, there's an opportunity to leverage that to do something more important or bigger. These rangers are on the ground in rural and remote areas, and they represent the only law and order in those areas. In many of the worst areas in terms of violence, these rangers are part of a public-private partnership. African Parks is one organization that brings together very disciplined guys to work with the local wildlife authorities to bring order. And the villagers in these places said to me, they are my protector. And some of the most dangerous forces in these remote areas are military, UN workers, as we know, and to have these smaller groups that are trained specifically and are working with Americans in many circumstances. You have an opportunity to address that.
My time has expired. General Ward, I hope to be able to have a conversation with you outside of these four walls. I think there is so much work to continue to do, and I'm really happy to help in any way that I can, Congresswoman Bass. The bigger humanitarian crisis that I'm interested in helping in the region is how these policies are impacting women that have been raped, their children, who's taking care of them, and the LGBT community is another issue that we have not addressed here today. So I yield back my expired time.
Okay. Let's go to Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Bass. And thank you to the witnesses. I have, as a member of this committee, I've had an opportunity to be in Africa a number of times, different countries. I left this meeting, we have so many meetings going on at the same time, but the reason I left the meeting a few minutes ago was to meet with a group of African women who are in a leadership program. Many of them are in parliaments in different areas of Africa. Just a lot of different wonderful leaders. So that's where I was. So it was interesting because I wanted to ask them about a topic that Representative Torres brought up, which is important not only to them, but I think to women all over the world, and that is being able to be in control of your own body and to decide when, if and when you want to have a family, because there is nothing that changes your life like having a family. I think everybody who has had a child knows that. What I think is also important, and I learned this, I was in Malawi last year in one of the villages, and one of the things they were stressing was the need to get women into the economy. And that seems to be another worldwide issue, is when you get women into the economy, it really, now you can double your productivity. It is very, very hard, difficult, sometimes impossible for women to become part of the economy and to sustain themselves in an economy if they cannot be in control of their own ability to plan their family. So it is with this global gag rule that President Trump has brought back is very, very worrisome. I know Representative Torres asked you about that. And I talked to the women just a few minutes ago, and the word that I got back from them was cruel. It is cruel. Part of the cruelty is not just what it could potentially do to a woman's health, because this is not all, it's just not all about abortion, but this gag rule is a chilling effect to any healthcare provider who may use their own money to either perform an abortion or save a woman who's gone and had an illegal abortion, which is very apparently prominent in Africa. So you have this chilling effect. And what they said is, if you're going to do this, which they, of course, they say, why are you doing this? Why don't you, give us enough notice so that there's not a gap in services? But what I'd like, I know you've commented with Representative Torres on this issue. What I'd like you to is talk about, if you can, the importance of women's involvement in the economy and how important it is to keep them healthy and vibrant.
Let me just offer an observation on the economic inclusion of women. There are many societies that have de facto and de jure constraints about women owning a title to land, being able to establish a business. They're, of course, being able to attain business licenses, getting the training necessary. I think there's certainly a trend among these organizations, such as those that you've met today, to try to level the playing field so that women can play a more formal role in their economies. So I think this is a process that people have their eye on. I won't comment on the gag order because I know that there's people here that can talk at greater depth about that than I am. But I do think this idea of women inclusiveness in the economy is an issue that's being worked on.
Congresswoman Frankel, I was in Africa last year, I believe, with the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, where we had a chance to visit with various activities that had some sponsorship put on that was a part of our U.S. foreign assistance. In particular, we visited a farm that was owned by a woman, and she and her children were doing things that were beyond any scope that program had been designed to take care of, making huge, huge progress, but not just for her and her family. She had also gathered and had caused other women to be a part of that co-op, if you will, creating a dynamic in that community that led to stability because their sons weren't being turned into terrorists. It led to increased health because they were producing products that were good for increasing their overall local health, and the products were of such quality that she has been exported, bringing revenue into that community. Women, when they're allowed and empowered through health, also through sponsorship and promotion to be entrepreneurs, definitely make a difference, a positive difference.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I yield back.
Thank you. And I would just note that Congresswoman Lois Frankel kept with a goal, which was yielding back time when there's time still to yield back. We go now to Ted Deutsch. It still beat the, it still sets a new record. We now go to Ted Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, there's strong bipartisan support in Congress for expanding our assistance to Africa, and I know that we'll put up a fight when the administration tries to cut U.S. support there in its 2018 budget. What worries me in the short term is the damage the President and his team have already done to our relationships with African leaders. Secretary Tillerson invited the chair of the African Union to visit Washington and then blew him off. All 60 African business leaders who were invited to an African trade conference in California had their visas denied by Trump's State Department, and the same State Department has no appointees to run offices and bureaus that oversee our work in Africa. We know the President wants to shutter 1/3 of USAID's 100 missions and cut 30% of its budget, which would certainly mean cuts in Africa, where the agency does the largest share of its work. The signal from the Trump administration seems to be pretty clear. The United States doesn't respect African leaders, doesn't want to do the work of partnering with African nations, and doesn't value U.S. engagement on the continent. Now, in Africa, every inch that we withdraw countries like China are ready to step in ways that are damaging to U.S. interests and the long-term well-being of the people of Africa. So, Ambassador Brigitty, I ask whether you're worried that even before we begin this budget debate, whether serious damage has already been done to our relationship with partners and friends in Africa, and also what's at stake if we abandon America's tradition of engagement and partnership with Africa in favor of what appears to be a rather incoherent and short-sighted withdrawal from Africa.
Congressman, thank you very much for the question. I'm just 2 weeks ago attended the World Economic Forum Africa in Durban, South Africa. And what I can tell you is in any number of conversations I had on the margins of that meeting with African business people, elected officials and whatnot, there is profound concern about the continued nature of American engagement in Africa under the Trump administration for reasons that you just articulated. I think that the way in which Chairperson Faki was treated was seen incredibly negatively, not only by the African Union Commission, but by African leaders across the continent. It is worth noting that, to his great credit, Secretary Tillerson subsequently had a phone call with Chairman Faki on May 8th to invite the chairperson to Washington, D.C. for the next round of the U.S.-Africa Strategic Dialogue. One hopes that happens. And that one can make up for those mistakes. But as an outsider looking in, that mistake, the mistake, for example, Rwandan President Paul Kagame, who was one of the most prominent leaders on the continent, was here in Washington about a little over a month ago. Nobody from the administration met with him. No one from the White House nor anyone in the State Department. And this suggests either one of two things. Either this administration has decided that Africa is not a strategic priority, and that is what explains these various sorts of things. Or what I believe is the more likely explanation is that the absence of senior leadership in the White House or the State Department is focused on Africa has helped abetted making what I think are, quite frankly, rookie mistakes with regard to the engagement of the continent. And this is why I think it is so vital for the administration to move with alacrity to appoint senior people at the State Department, in the White House, and also at senior ambassadorships across the continent.
Thank you, Ambassador. If you're right, and we can chalk this up to rookie mistakes, as we wait for them to figure it out, as we wait for these positions to be filled, General Ward, what impact does that have from a national security standpoint and on U.S. forces?
Congressman, we have to continue to cause our presence and our interests to be felt and realized in other areas until that day then does come. And so therefore, we're not going to wring our hands. We're going to just reinforce our efforts in other areas. For example, next month, the U.S.-Africa Business Summit will be here in D.C., hosted by the Corporate Council in Africa. And certain African leaders will be in attendance, and how support is rallied around to show that in spite of whatever else may be going on, there's still support for the continent, and we do it through those sorts of programs and showing support, participating in, and endorsing in ways that then, as they return, based on relationship that was established here, the word will be spread that it is not over. And we have to just double down on our efforts to cause that to be the case.
I appreciate that. Thanks to all the witnesses for being here today.
Would the gentleman yield just on a point?
Of course.
Because I think we're in concurrence on a lot of issues, but I just wanted to address this issue of President Paul Kagame. Because to bring this up without explaining that one of the reasons we did not, on this committee, ask for meetings with President Paul Kagame was because of several assassinations of political opponents outside his own country, in a third country. On top of that, we had the problem with his suppression of freedom of expression and the human rights abuses. So once you have situations where you have assassinations, admitted assassinations, I think we could argue the point, but certainly that point was defended. You could understand why we weren't anxious to orchestrate a meeting while he was here in the first months of the new administration. So I think sometimes disclosing all of the factors in a situation like that would be important. That said, I do want to thank our witnesses here today.
Mr. Chairman,
yes.
I'm sorry, just before I
me-
yield back, I appreciate what you say. I would
Yes.
just, I would just add, though, that if we have a valid concern, if what's driving decisions like that is suppression of freedom of expression and concern about human rights, I would respectfully suggest that that the President of the United States had no business meeting and welcoming President Erdogan into the White
listen,
House. But I yield back.
Yes, I think, and you'll see my statements on that point as well. But what I'm trying to point out, I'm trying to establish some objectivity when it comes to this debate, because many of the points that we're raising here are points that we need to raise as a committee. But at the same time, we have to be objective in terms of our choice of examples and not mislead. And I think it's clear that as we're discussing the challenges that we want to see met in Africa, and there's many of the challenges that we've discussed here, the fact that some governments are kleptocratic in nature, the weak institutions that we spoke to, the Islamist extremists that are a problem for many governments there, the wildlife trafficking and how the way that that feeds into terror, as well as the elimination, potentially, of the populations of elephants and certainly of the rhinoceros. I mean, the very real likelihood that in our lifetime the rhinoceros will be an extinguished species if we don't turn this around. And all of that draws people, if we can get sustainable development, draws people to see that magnificent continent, and it supports the people in that continent. But there are also these tremendous opportunities. There is that great resource that Africa has, which is the people of Africa. And the young people that I've had the opportunity to meet over many years of travel to the region, and which our panel are all too familiar with, they want a better future. They want it, and I believe that they will get it. I believe it will help if we can work in a bipartisan way here to make sure that they get it. I think the United States has a stake in their future. I think supporting the growth of healthier, more stable communities in Africa serves our diplomatic, our economic, our humanitarian, and our security interests. I think U.S. engagement can help prevent the spread of diseases. One of the issues is Ebola, where this crosses borders and, frankly, can cross our own border. It can help prevent and address insecurity before extremism takes hold on these young minds. And it can help open new markets that will create opportunities for Americans, as well as help communities in Africa grow their own way out of poverty. So U.S. engagement with Africa is smart and essential. And I look forward to working with the administration and my colleagues here in Congress to ensure that we get this right. And I thank, again, our panel. We are adjourned.